Hello everybody, welcome. Do you hear the crows? Do you hear the timing of their signals? Of course, once I began to pay attention to them, they went quiet. That particular kind of signal is sometimes associated with the presence of a raptor nearby. And there's another signal. What I'm going to try to talk about today, and it'll be an attempt, is organisms as modes of time-space. I've been thinking a lot about this topic lately and writing some about it. I have a couple essays on my Medium channel. One is on the nature of biorelational time, and the other talks about a metric for biorelational time. Unfortunately, we are trained to think in terms of mechanical time. And it's a useful metric, but it's also mostly wrong. If we want to ask deep and insightful questions about the nature of time, it's important to be able to think in terms of temporal manifolds. We can limit the scope of a manifold however we like. And what I mean by the term is really a multi-dimensional structure. I usually call it a hyperstructure because most of our experience of temporal manifolds is extremely complex. Now, this is going to be a little bit challenging for me because I'm not well prepared. So I'm winging it on a topic that's about as deep as any topic can be. But when we change our perspectives about time, we're introduced to a new universe, one that's always been here as us, with us, but is mostly invisible to us because of the structured fictions we inherit from language and culture, also from science. Our scientific thinking about time is mostly still quite primitive. And that primitivity is a result of a mechanistic trend in science that probably goes back to sometime around the 1700s. It's the kind of model, or an array of models, that present the universe as a sort of dead inside mechanical structure with the possible exception of humans and our minds. Now, the weird thing about that is that in a way, what we've done with these models is euthanize most of our accessible intelligence, faculties, abilities, insights, for the sake, primarily, of producing physical technologies, most of which, I would argue, are largely unnecessary, lethal to life on Earth, and crippling to our own minds and capacities for insight, awareness, intelligence, consciousness, and so on. If you imagine a universe that's simply a solid iron, actually, that wouldn't work. Let's try to imagine, even that won't work. Let's try to imagine a universe with one entirely inert substance. No features, no particles, just one substance. Hard to imagine. But in such a universe, it would be impossible for there to be time. And I want you to think of time in relational terms. In Einstein's relativity, I'm not sure if he introduces this concept, though I think he does. He introduces the concept of world lines. And because the light, time, matter path of anything capable of interacting with other features of the universe is locally unique to the entity supposed here. And it makes a kind of a physical tunnel, which is, of course, comprised of time-space. At least this is what I'm going to call it, because we don't have better language yet to describe the sort of crystallizations of the features of time-space that we find in stars, planets, black holes, white holes, nebula, galaxies, quasars, pulsars, moons, comets, asteroids, meteors, and organisms and machines. Each of these are modes of time-space. We could invent a term, particularly if we knew more about what the existence of time-space represents or portends. But for now, I'm going to stick with that term as the uniphore from which all other sub-processes originate. So it's obvious that in time-space, and this is a synonym for the universe, planets, galaxies, stars, and so forth emerge naturally from the medium. And one of the key insights that Einstein gave us, which we have still failed to integrate, is to think of time and space as one thing. If we do that, if we accept his gambit, then it is clear that what we call matter, and there are many different modes of that, is a derivation of the features of time-space. Much in the same way that if I left a glass of water on my table for a long time that I didn't put there, when it evaporated, I later found white crystals in the bottom of the glass, tasted them, they're salty, tested them, they turn out to be sodium chloride. We would understand that the water is salty. And we can think of time-space a little bit like this glass of water. Over time, linear time, one world line time, like the age of the universe, which has currently been upgraded to 27 billion years, I believe. was previously about 13 billion. And that's a flat one world line measurement, as if there's only a single process happening and a single observer with a single world line. And I'll try to explain what a world line is. So it's clear that over the age of the universe, time-space produces phenomena within itself, within its body, and I want us to think of it a little bit like a strange kind of water or ocean, much as our distant ancestors did when they looked at the night sky. So what we will see is, in our theories at least, we will see that the features of time-space we are familiar with, galaxies, stars, nebula, and so on, essentially condense out of this medium. And so it's fairly easy for people to imagine that a star, like our sun, is a mode of time-space. It's a specific physical body in time-space, and local to that star there are a unique array of events per interval, whatever interval we may select and whatever kinds of events we may select to count, so that we can count something like, we can make a reasonable determination of the amount of heat probably produced by the sun in various forms of radiation. We can make an estimate of the probability of a photon produced near the core of the sun reaching the surface and being ejected into space. Now, the sun is incredibly magnetically tangled inside. It's sort of a seething spaghetti mess of entangled, I don't mean that in terms of physics, of tangly magnetic fields, such that, I may get the number wrong here, but I believe that it can take as much as 8 million years for a photon, presuming that there are such things, to travel from somewhere near the core of the sun to the surface at, we must imagine, some fraction of the speed of light, a large fraction. Now, I don't know what the distance is between the core and the surface, but it's nothing like 8 million light years. So you can see that the sun is incredibly magnetically tangled inside. That tangling channels photons in some extremely complex way, such that some may find a relatively faster path to the surface, but many will take millions or hundreds of thousands of years, again, traveling at light speed, right? Or something, some meaningful fraction of that. So what you can see there is that the nature of time relative to light, photons within the sun, is very different from what we would expect. The photon is traveling at light speed, but it's negotiating an incredibly complex array of magnetic paths that are channeling it, such that it may take an unimaginably long time for it to reach the surface and be emitted if it was produced somewhere near the core. And this is a good example of the temporalities involved in modes of time-space. obviously, whatever is happening to the photon in terms of some kind of event per some kind of interval, travel, so on, transformation, reflection, is not ordinary. It's not a free photon. And it's probably unlikely that we could determine with any degree of accuracy the number of photons being produced by the sun per second, if in fact it's producing them. But each of them has a unique world line, the tunnel in time-space that photon makes over some interval. And similarly, an ant, from birth to death, being a condensate of time-space, a living condensate of time-space, could be understood as at first an egg-shaped tunnel and then an ant-shaped tunnel through time-space, spinning around on the surface of the Earth, dragged through the interstellar medium by the sun, dragging the Earth. And so it would produce a spirally line over time from its birth until its death. Now, we're going to leave birth and death alone, except to use them as demarcations in this case. But I just want you to think of a non-moving object, an object that is stationary on the surface of the Earth. Let's call it a tree. And imagine that as the Earth spins, there is a tree-like tunnel in time-space. Inside that tunnel is the tree's interior. Outside that tunnel are all of the beings the tree relates with. But what we would get is that tree shape spinning around on the surface of the Earth and then also spiraling in a corkscrew kind of fashion as the sun drags the orbiting Earth through time-space. So we get a few different degrees of movement. Now, if you have a creature on the surface of the Earth that moves around, then the line is more complex, local to the surface, because it will include the organism's movements at a very small, at a scale local to the organism's body. If we zoomed way out, those little terrestrial movements would become trivial, but they'd still exist. So your world line is the tunnel in time-space made from, say, the time that the egg you came from is fertilized and becomes a hypercell from that egg-shaped, and that would remain in your mother's womb. So there would be an egg-shaped tunnel originating in your mother's womb and following your mother's body around on the surface of the Earth until you emerge as an infant. And then you would be a baby-shaped tunnel in time-space, again spinning around on the surface of the Earth. And then as you began to travel, you would make a sort of wiggly line within the spinning Earth and within the spiraling Earth following the sun through time-space. And then we can add other dimensions, right, as we wish. For example, the perspective from the scale of a galaxy. Now, the way that we think about time usually is mechanical and single world line. This is why we would say the universe is 13 billion years old, or life on Earth is 3.5 billion years old. We have the same problem in thinking about time that we had with thinking about the surface of the Earth when we believed it to be flat, if indeed anyone truly ever believed that. We think the flatness in time is the singular perspective, the single world line measurement, as if there's only a single world line and only one observer. So when we measure the age of the universe to be 27 billion years, we mean 27 billion flat, one observer, one world line years, which is of course impossible. There might have been a phase of the universe where there were few or no world lines for particles, but that would be very early and would quickly disappear as hydrogen or helium began to form. And those atoms or molecules have their own world lines. So they make a tunnel through time-space, and they are also a condensate of time-space. If you have, say, just 2 hydrogen atoms in the universe, then whatever the rate of events per interval are for hydrogen atoms, let's say if electrons orbit, it might be the rate of the orbital iterations of the electron, if indeed it orbits. And you would have those over some interval, over some fraction of a second. So you would have 2 hydrogen world lines, and you would have the relationships between those 2, even if they were at opposite ends of the universe. And if they were, we would presume they have no relationship, but that's not realistic. In order to understand time, we have to count the world lines. So that, for example, a single year presently on Earth, one flat year, is 8 billion human life years. 8 billion unique human experiencers with their unique world lines in time-space, interacting with each other, the biosphere, the sun, the moon, time-space itself. The other planets are involved. And so you have a very complex hyperstructure, right? Because you have 8 billion distinguishable world lines. So 1 second is 8 billion human seconds presently. And perhaps now you're beginning to see why I call the temporal forms hyperstructures. Because if you were to track all 8 billion humans and the events per interval that we're interested in, whether that's heartbeats, respirations, or metabolic transformations in their cells, each of those humans contains something like, I think, how many? Approximately 60 trillion cells, about 43% of which are bacterial, right? They're not eukaryotic. A little less than half are cells. So we don't know what a second is like for a cell, but it's probably very different in terms of the kinds and number of events per interval, say 1 second, than it is for us humans, particularly in consciousness. So 1 human second is around, we'll say, 50 trillion cell seconds. And each of those cells is doing extremely complex behaviors over that second. In fact, it is estimated that to accurately simulate the cell, I believe at the atomic level, but it could be the molecular level, to accurately simulate 1 second of one cell would take the Fugaku, the fastest computer on Earth, pinned at 100% of its capacity, about 300 million years. and I just can't remember if that's the atomic level. The molecular level, we'd have a better shot at simulating. But as you can see, a cell is very busy over 1 second. Now, consider the difference between 3 different things. Maybe we're going to do the Spanish Inquisition here. 4 different things, 5. But consider the difference between a cell-sized chunk of time-space, right? Just go out into space outside the solar system. We're going to go outside the solar system to grab this chunk. And just track a single cell-sized tunnel, right, in time-space over, say, 1 second. How many events will you get in there? And what kinds of events will you get? Well, you might get some photons. You might get some other forms of radiation or EM, electromagnetism. But you're not going to have a vast number of events over a second. Let's say you have, and I really don't know, it would also depend on what we're tracking. If we're tracking neutrinos, quarks, like what's the scale, and what specific elements are we counting? But you can imagine that you'd get a pretty modest number of events per second, maybe even less than 12, though I don't know the answer to this question. Okay, so then we can take a condensate of time-space here on Earth, call it a human blood cell. We'll get a radically different number of events per second. Again, it matters what we're counting and how, but we're probably talking about, at the atomic level, wild guess here, many billions of events. At the molecular level, and when I say many, I mean like, I don't know, 100,000 billion, something like this. The molecular level would be significantly smaller, but probably still in the billions of events that we could track. And then, so there are 2, right? We've got a little cell-sized chunk of time-space, a little cell-sized actual cell, an organism. And then we could also take a cell-sized chunk of, say, an active microprocessor, and how many events per second we'd get in there and what kinds of events. Now, obviously, the kinds of events differ dramatically in time-space, a cell, and a microscopic chunk of a semiconductor. In other words, what the elements, quarks and leptons and bosons and photons and electrons and molecules and atoms, what they are doing, if they are doing much at all, is radically different. Because whatever it is that's participating in the existence of organisms and sustaining that existence, we must imagine to be vastly more meaningful and profound than empty time-space. It's not really empty, there's light in there at least, even if it's in a vacuum. And similarly to the dead and or highly repetitive events per interval in, say, a microprocessor. So what I want to point out is that these are different modes of time-space. And the machines that the humans produce are highly problematical, I think, because I believe that they're offloading a form of temporal entropy into the biorelational temporal hyperstructures of the planet and of the organisms. Now, if we're thinking about age, the actual age of the universe is incalculably vast. Even if we were to take one world line per star and not count anything else, it would be an unimaginable number of star seconds per second. And if we were then to include all the other features of the universe, it would just explode into layered infinities of impossibly enormous numbers. It's okay to use the one world line timescale, in part because if we were to actually try to count the multi-world line thing, we need a lot of information we don't have. And even if we could estimate the number of stars with some degree of accuracy, which I think is unlikely, we'd also need to know the difference between a star second, in other words, how many events per interval happen for a star, and a human second. Now, the human second is a convenience that doesn't really exist, except perhaps in our thought and consciousness. Because again, our own bodies are an incredibly sophisticated, many-dimensional biorelational temporal hyperstructure, and we are embedded here on a living planet with countless organisms. And if we're counting organisms, we have to decide at what scale to stop. Do we stop at the scale of the cell, in which case we have an unimaginable number? Do we stop at the scale of distinct organisms, in which case we still have an unimaginable number? Or do we stop at the scale, do we only count animals? Do we only count animals plus trees? What do we count? And each of those forms, the bee, the wasp, the bear, the beaver, the seagull, the hawk, the owl, the skunk, the badger, the hammerhead shark, the whale, the ants. We have an incredible diversity of living derivations, modes, if you will, of time-space. In a way, a living planet is in some senses more complex than the universe. I don't know how many different kinds of objects astronomers have cataloged, but it's probably less than 1,000, right? And I don't know how many different kinds of organisms there are on Earth, but at the cellular level, it's a huge astronomical number. So you can see that time-space creates these biorelational manifolds like our planet, in which time undergoes a radical series of unique modes, transformations, activities. And since matter is not really separate from space-time, it's a unique mode of space-time, the incredible material complexity of the Earth is unlike, it has many, many layers that a non-living planet, if we presume that Mars is non-living, doesn't have. It's as if there's a biorelational temporal membrane on the surface of the Earth, under the ground, in the sky, in which each organism and its relationship with all other organisms creates new forms of time. I'm looking right now at a dragonfly and a damselfly hovering over some vegetation in the water. And the dragonfly has landed. When I see a life form, what I am seeing and what I am thinking about seeing, it can change depending on my purpose and perspective. But I feel that I am seeing, literally, the face of timespace itself. In each of the organisms, I am seeing the character, nature, intelligence, and distributed unity in any organism I may come across. The insects are particularly interesting because time for them is very different than it is for an animal. There appears to be something that resembles a metric that we can use to understand the unique temporalities of different organisms. Now, obviously, if you have 2 ants, you get 2 ant seconds per second. And you get another dimension, which is the relationship between those 2 ants. And a third dimension, which is the relationship between each ant, both ants, and the other environmental temporalities. If there were only 2 ants, then they'd be the only organismal temporalities on that planet. If there are billions and billions of ants, which there are on Earth, then you have what I call a temporal hyperstructure, because of course the ants are not alone on Earth. They are relating with each other, with the ants that are local to them, and in some way with the distributed history of ants on Earth, the future of ants on Earth, and all the other organisms that comprise the membrane of life on our world. I'm going to pause for a moment, and I shall return shortly. I am here at the San Joaquin Delta, and although I don't fish anymore, I was once a fisherman, and I used to fish here when I was a child with some frequency. That frequency term turns out to be extremely important. But in the background, I can hear the engines of cars, and in the distance, a combine is producing a solid wall of machine noise. I see here a broad variety of vegetal life, some trees, Thule Islands. There are probably, I can hear the calls of many water birds. There are probably beavers, muskrats, a broad variety of fish, including perch, bass, crappie, catfish, carp, minnows of various sorts, tadpoles, turtles. I see wasps and bees. On one of my recent visits a few months ago, just after the rain, I discovered a baby turtle that had just emerged from its egg in the mud. And I carried it across the broken rocks that are used to line the levees here so that it wouldn't have to negotiate that mess to get to the water. Some people criticized me for that. And I can understand their criticisms, even if they were a bit severe. I said something like, "Oh, you're the kind of guy that, helps a butterfly out of the cocoon?" Right? And they supposed that it was part of the turtle's test of life to cross this almost impassable barrier of rocks that it would need to cross to get to the water. I do not presume that. I presume something very different. And one of the presumptions that I make is that, because it seems natural to me, I tend to think from unity toward distinction rather than the way that we're taught from distinction toward unity. So as far as I'm concerned, there's really just one organism here on Earth. But I want you to think about the different experiences of time you may have and how certain experiences change temporality. Most of us find boredom very troubling, and boredom could be described temporally as the sudden or gradual disappearance of meaningful events per interval, whatever the interval we may choose. When we are engaged in an activity, our consciousness and bodies are occupied with that activity, and that changes time for us. It changes our experience of time. Mechanical's time still passes at the same universal rate, we imagine. I'm not sure that's actually true, but since we established the standard and we agreed to the standard, and the standard appears objectively measurable, we may presume that the seconds continue to pass at the same rate, but our experience of them does not. Excitement, fascination, insight, wonder, awe, creativity are all ways that we transform temporalities. Our technologies, cars and jets and computers and war and guns and so on, all radically alter temporality. Guns kill by accelerating an object in timespace. The world line of the bullet enters the world line of a living body, creating what we could imagine is certainly a physical shock and physical damage to the body, but we usually don't think of the temporal shock the bullet creates by entering the body. Essentially what's happening is you're encountering a world line whose frequency of movement through time-space is so different from your own that we could imagine that the temporal shock alone is enough to kill. Obviously, an explosion is a physical shock, but it is also a temporal shock. It is an acceleration of the medium within which the explosion is taking place. Our refrigerators slow time, our ovens accelerate time, our computers accelerate time by allowing billions of computations per interval and creating a kind of window through which we interact with the virtual results of those temporalities. Most screens have something like a refresh rate, even light bulbs. We can measure them, I think, in hertz or megahertz or perhaps in some cases terahertz. These are all measurements of frequency. You can handle a certain amount of radiation per interval of various kinds, but if it goes too high, you burn, and if it goes too low, you freeze. So you can see that we're existing in a broad, vast array of temporalities, particularly the organismal temporalities of Earth. And outside of those, we would not exist. We have the idea that we may one day travel in space, time, but it's not clear that human bodies or minds can survive for long outside the little band that the Earth travels in around the sun. There's much that we do not know. But what I was thinking when I was back at the water, I was just thinking about a fisher person. We usually colloquially use the term fisherman, and I realized that we live in a culture where we are trying to be a bit more attentive to gender words in various ways. But as a fisherman, I was one. It's a mode of relating with time that's very unique, not entirely dissimilar to hunting. Obviously, if we love organisms, which is the reason I no longer fish, we don't want to hurt them. But the fisherman may take some bait, which is usually an organism or a piece of an organism, attach it to a hook, cast the line in the water, and wait. Often, the fisherman may see fish surfacing, and when they do, they create ripples. Those ripples are easily detectable to the eye because they transform light. And the fisherman waits with their line in the water for a fish to take the bait. And the fisherman hopes they will be able to hook the fish if it's the kind of fish that they are seeking. So you can see that fishing is a way of remaining interested in what is often slow time, at least around here. Depends on where you fish and how good a fisherman or fisher person you may be, how many interactions with fish you will have per interval. But you are seeking fish per interval. Similarly, we seek food per interval, warmth per interval, coolness per interval if it's too hot, water per interval. So these are meaningful events in our human experience. And we can ignore eating for a time. And if we fast, we enter into a very different relationship with time itself as the body's metabolism transforms gradually, but over a period of, say, 24 to 48 hours, our body's metabolism will change, the inner temporality of our bodies will change as a result of those metabolic transformations, and we will have a different experience of time. We get into cars to skip intervals. I can't walk to Oregon from here. Well, I could, in theory, but I can drive there in a given number of hours or days. There are many organisms on Earth from whom we can learn a great deal about the nature of time. And one of the most fascinating of them, I'm going to talk about two here, is spiders. Black widow spiders make a relatively disorganized web, often near the ground, and they are essentially sifting timespace. That web extends their world line, right? The web and the spider can be understood as the same thing, or the web can be understood as an extension of the spider. But what it's doing is literally sifting timespace for insects. A little bit different from what the fisherman is doing, but relatively similar in some ways, right? The fisherman is using the line to extend their world line in such a way as to capture fish. An orb weaver spider generally makes a spiraline web, which similarly sifts timespace for insects and is similarly an extension of the spider's world line. These metaphors are very useful because we humans do the same kind of thing, but we do it with different prostheses. Yeah? So an influencer casts something resembling a web into the internet and captures attention, human attention, and what we could call engagement. This is a word we use to measure the influencer's ability to use the internet to capture human interaction, attention, opportunity, and also threat. So you can see that we have a similar way of extending ourselves, extending our world lines into both technological dimensions, such as the internet, commercial dimensions, such as those concerned with various commodities, relational dimensions, including our pets and children and so forth, gardens, you name it. So all of life is engaged in a very complex array of relationships. We tend to think of organisms as distinct. They cannot be. We imagine that some organisms are predators and others are prey. The categorical distinction is useful, but it's also confused because from a perspective just above that, the predator and the prey comprise a single organism that appears distinct in the world and in our lexicons, but is fundamentally one creature. All of life on Earth is like this. The organisms need all the other organisms to survive, and damage to the ecologies lands in all the organisms, whether or not that landing is instantaneous. I would argue that in the temporal dimension, it's nearly instantaneous in one domain. There are other domains in which the effects spread out over time, like the ripples from that rising fish. You can see that the solar system is peculiar in that each of the planets is unique. Obviously, they're all related to each other at the very least through gravity, but they are probably related to each other in a way that is similar to the distinct organisms of Earth, so that we might think of the solar system as resembling a cell with the sun being the nucleus. I think it was Lewis Thomas, who probably wasn't the first to notice it, that from space, the Earth most resembles a large single-celled organism. It has a membrane, which is its atmosphere, and then the organisms within it could be understood as analogous to mitochondria, but one of them tends to misbehave wildly via technology, and that's our people. You can see that time-space is flowing in the same way that, so the spider in its web makes a tunnel in time-space over time, over flat time, right? And insects that intersect with that tunnel at specific intervals are captured and feed the spider and perhaps their young. So we can see that the temporalities of each of the planets are unique. They are unique because of their chemical constituency. There may be organismal life. There may be forms of life. There may be forms of beings that exist that don't have bodies, but that localize around planets for the reason that the temporality there is much more complex than the temporality in empty space-time, which of course again isn't exactly empty. It's just there are few kinds of events that can happen and the intervals are extremely long. Whereas around any planet there are billions of events per any interval we might imagine. Even if they are merely material events such as the transformations of molecules, chemistry, rocks, gases, and so on. So the planets each circle the sun with a period that is different from the other planets. The closer ones circle faster, the further ones circle more slowly. And this is why some people have compared the solar system to something resembling the human flat time idea of a clock. Now, Einstein made it clear that clocks were localized to observers. That's why if you travel, if you accelerate, clocks slow down. I suppose if we could imagine slowing down so dramatically that relative to time-space, we were moving less and less per interval, perhaps time would speed up in a corollary fashion. But the point is that it is as if each being, each organism, each unique world line has its own experience of the universe and relations within it. It is not as if each being is a clock. We need a better metaphor because it's an amechanical situation. It is not mechanized, it's biologized. And biology represents an astonishing mode of time-space that is probably the single rarest and most precious resource, because if there are things like souls or non-corporeal beings, you can only really have physical experience on planets that have organismal life. Unless, of course, it is possible that such beings can inhabit material objects such as rocks, waters, crystals, so on, which I think is fairly likely to be true. But you don't have to believe me. Part of the reason I think that's true is because I understand the waters of time-space to be implicitly transcendent, which is more than merely intelligent. Time-space produces condensates as organisms and minds of its own substance. And I would suggest that that substance is of a kind we have yet to imagine and we have no language for, which is part of why I invented this term transcendent. Local to the sun, our world produces temporal, biotemporal hyperstructures. Hi. And relational and cognitive hyperstructures, such as the cognitium of the humans, which is the network of all human minds. Again, I tend to think from unity into distinction. I found it interesting that Einstein didn't write mc squared equals E. he started with the unity, E equals mc squared. He was thinking from unity to distinction. This would be like if we flipped around our ordinary arithmetic so that we wrote it 5 equals 2 plus 3. We tend to start with the parts, which is useful, but it's also blinding because we believe that the parts have precedence if we count that way. Ant time is an expression of the nature of time-space. Wasp time, tree time. The tree is a mode, a condensate, a crystallization of the possibilities inherent in the medium, in the same way that those salt crystals in my little glass of water tell us that the water was salty. If we have eyes and minds and hands and wings and tentacles and fins and scales and spines and leaves and flowers and so on, these must be exemplars of the nature, character, intelligence, and perhaps intention of time-space. Pause for a moment here, and I will return shortly. So I have come to a park, and prior to being at the park, most of what was going on was houses and machines. But now that I am at the park, I am local to what looks to me, at a first guessed estimate, to be about 450 people. My spatio-temporal context changed from 1 to 3 cars per 5 minutes and a few humans per interval to suddenly humans everywhere per interval. So I have entered a transformed biorelational context that contains many distributed humans, most of whom are playing games or observing games or are engaged in some sort of physical activity. There was a man selling ice creams and snacks, right? So that the people here can have food events per interval. And you can see that the kinds of events per interval that you get are dependent on the biologies that you have at play. With ants, you get ant-like events per interval. Wasps, wasp-like events per interval. Whales, interval, the same thing. Any of the forms, what you have are different kinds of meaningful events for the organism per interval, and in some cases, for the consciousness per interval. We tend to presume that only humans are complexly conscious. This seems impossible to me. It is my direct experience that all of organismal life is conscious. It's simply not representationally cognitive. It doesn't use tokens, maps, models, and concepts to negotiate existence. I'm not sure I would say that trees have minds, at least not the way that we think of the concept of a mind as humans, but they certainly have something very similar. They are beings, they have awareness. We often use the word sentient to refer to this quality of living awareness. And we may decide that certain organisms have more of it, certain organisms have less. But the problem is, without all the organisms together, you don't get any of it. You certainly don't get anything as complex as what we are capable of. And as it turns out, the complexities we're capable of are pretty much the most lethal thing that has ever happened to the biosphere. So there's a big question in my mind about the nature of human intelligence, because it appears that at least at the species level, we are captured by processes that cause us to defect from relational insight, integrity, and awareness, which animals very rarely do, and trees probably almost never. I can see in the sunlight thousands of tiny insects lighting up like living stars. And the insect life on Earth represents an array of field intelligences that are unimaginably ancient. It turns out that when we begin to think about world lines, and particularly about the age in life years of organisms, they are unimaginably old. I can't remember the precise number, but I did some math, and a common housefly has 135 quadrillion ancestors. Each of those ancestors lived 20 days. Even if houseflies experience time at precisely the same rate as humans, they are thousands of billions of years old as a species. The humans, by comparison, are incredibly young. I don't know how many ancestors a human has. There's a problem with the profusion of ancestors as we go backwards in time and measurement, which I've never seen a good solution for. Obviously, if every human has 2 ancestors, some of those ancestors are shared by other humans, but we get an impossible number if we go back, say, 1,000 years or 10,000 years. So there's a problem with doing the math of progenitor time. But what I want you to understand is any insect you see is catastrophically older in terms of the life years of evolutionary development and the physicalization of intelligence in that organism. It makes the universe look like it just showed up yesterday. Again, organisms are to time as stars are to light. We make forms of time.
$3, 3.50. Good shot. Yeah, I want you to try that again. Do that same thing. Dribble into a shot. You get to that corner, stop. Dribble all the way.
I am observing some people shooting baskets. And of course, our sports games, you can see, as a particular mode of time, right? It's baskets or goals or home runs per interval. A living planet has a unique mode of temporality and probably an array of unique rates of temporality for each organism that exists there and for each form. The forms are unique modes of the character and nature and transcendence of time-space, and they form a hypersymphony of symbiosis together that not only sustains the envelope, the atmospheric envelope of Earth, it enriches time. The more forms of organisms you have, the more complex the local biorelational temporal manifold becomes, And the more complex that becomes, the more resistant it is to sudden catastrophe, i.e., apocalypse. Unless and until you have a form like ours, which does not understand time, thinks of organisms and living places as disposable commodities, and formulates a complex multi-temporal array of threats, all emerging from one source, mechanization. The ant, though it may consume other organisms, its biorelational molecular chemistry, and perhaps atomic chemistry, and possibly even quantum chemistry, fundamentally supports the manifold. All of the organisms here are symbiotic, whether they feed on each other or not. And there are different modes of symbiosis. I think there's like 7. Phoresis, parasitism, a variety of modes that I cannot remember the catalog of at the moment. But the organisms of Earth seem to have innately not only the ability to enrich the local biotemporal relationships and manifolds, but to heal them. So that if humans offload a certain amount of damage onto the environment through technology, there's a limit to what they can absorb, but they will try to absorb it and effectively to repair it. Unfortunately, we are quickly reaching the precipice beyond which the organisms and their complex relationships and the sophisticated ecologies that have developed here and been conserved over millions of years are at imminent risk of catastrophic failure. And this is in part because whatever machines are doing in time, it is not the same thing that organisms are doing. The organisms are relationally integral. The machines are largely omnicidal. They kill arbitrarily, they kill by existing, they offload mechanical entropy into the biorelational temporal manifolds, which effectively damages it. Perhaps catastrophically, there doesn't seem to be anything that will stop the humans from continuing with this bizarre behavior. We live in representations, not in relationships as a species. And so what we want to do, apparently, is to convert the living things into dead things and put them in boxes in banks and museums and so on. The question of how we became so confused is a complex one that I've examined in many of my other videos. But effectively, it has to do with problems inherent to the formation of representational cognition in our species. I'm going to pause to recollect my thoughts and we'll return shortly. Some people, Sabine Hofenstadter, for example, whoops. One moment. Sorry about the noise there. A physicist who I believe is also an atheist. I don't know exactly what that means, but it seems to mean a belief that there is nothing transcendental to the mechanics of phenomena. that is meaningful or accessible to human knowledge. I think that's an absurd position in general, though I'm not meaning to defame Sabine. She's a prodigy and a genius, and I'm so grateful to have minds like hers here with me. I learn from her all the time. But I remember her commenting recently regarding aliens and UFOs, which is a topic I've been following somewhat lately, and I think is relevant to this conversation, that the humans are stupid and uninteresting. As a species, we are certainly stupid. If the Earth is, as I am proposing, a single organism with her organs on the outside, a sort of ever virginal womb penetrated by light, producing infinite varieties of complex children, then the Earth itself is incredibly fascinating, and the humans are problematical in the following sense. Even if there are many living planets in timespace, even if there are billions of them, it does not make this one less unique or precious or special. There is a perspective from which the more of something you have, and this is not common for humans to think this way, the more of something you have, the more precious each individual instance of it becomes. And I would argue that as concerns time, transcendence, intelligence, and relationships, this is the kind of counting that is actually going on, not the commodity kind where more pennies makes each penny less valuable. So what I would argue is that the planet is definitely important in time-space, and it's particularly extremely important in this locale of time-space because it represents a complex biotemporal hyperstructure. And that temporality, the complexity of that temporality, makes it an incredibly precious participant. Now, some people could say, oh, you mean resource. Well, yes, it's possible to treat it as a resource, but that's not what I mean. I mean participant, a being. Earth is the kind of a being. I'm going to put my windscreen on here, so that may muffle my voice a little bit, but hopefully it'll cut some of the wind noise. Let's see here. There we go. Test. Let me just look at my test. Okay. So, when I say transcendent, I mean something transcendental to our categories, without which we would not have minds. The relationship between the Earth and the Sun is so profound that it produces organisms and minds as a side effect of whatever its missions are. And I believe that it has missions. I believe these are transcendental beings, not things. And we are unaware of their missions, but the organisms, simply by existing as they do, help with and support those missions, whatever they may be, whatever their status may be. Hi. So it's my perspective that not only are humans not the most important thing going on around here, there are things of unimaginable importance going on around here. And the organisms create biorelational manifolds simply by existing. They don't have to be morally perfect. They don't have to be ethically perfect. Just simply existing creates the rich temporal hypersymphonies that are local to this planet, and I would suggest that not only are the Earth and the Sun not things, they are transcendental to our categories entirely. We would not have categories without them. No sun, no physics, no math, no bombs, no science, no religion, no language, no categories, no human knowledge, nothing around here. So you can see that locally, these two features, and the moon is included, so are the other planets, we don't know what would happen if one of the planets were subtracted. We might imagine that there'd be no catastrophic effect, but it could mean that there couldn't be life here, too. So the sun, the moon, and the earth, at least for us earth-dwelling beings, are unimaginably important. Without them, there is nothing. No arguments, right? You can't argue with this. It's a fact beyond all facts. We would not have facts without the sun and the earth and the moon. Right? There'd be no facts and no one to consider them around here. But I would also argue that biorelational hyperstructures link up across time-space, and I believe that there's an instantaneous network that connects all the living planets, probably all the stars, and maybe all the planets themselves, in a superposition of which the planets and worlds and stars are subpositions, such that when you look at the diverse library of organisms here on Earth, what you are seeing is not merely the face of local time-space. You are seeing in the face of the wasp, in the face of the praying mantis, in the face of the octopus, the whale, the jaguar, the eagle, the bluebird, the mouse, the dolphin, the gazelle, the giraffe, the rhinoceros, the elephant. You are actually seeing the faces of life in time-space, as if all the living worlds draw from a single source to produce their local condensates that appear to us as distinct organisms. Now, I'm not trying to convince you that this is certainly the case, though the biorelational hyperstructures in time, I think, are certainly the case. What I'm saying is it is incredibly useful to think this way, right? If you can perceive this way, you will have access to forms of intelligence and faculties that would otherwise be very difficult to experience, understand, or have contact with. Whatever our nature may be as human beings, it is certainly not the stories we have been told. There is effectively no chance of those stories being true, except in representational thought, language, and behavior. I believe that, belief is a strange word here, but it's certainly my perspective that the Earth is doing something so monumentally important that, and being someone so monumentally important, and has friends and relationships that are so crucial to the nature of time-space, that any damage to the local temporal manifold would be recognized immediately by life forms or beings that were transcendent or actually intelligent. It also is useful to notice that in many of the stories that we hear about humans having contact with the occupants of the craft that we refer to as UFOs or UAPs now, radical transformations of time appear to occur. We should pay very careful attention to that, because what it means is that clock time is wrong. And there are situations in which even clock time changes dramatically and unexpectedly. Of course, there's a very common situation that we almost experience regularly, which is dreaming. And not merely dreaming, but also the unusual state of consciousness that we refer to as trance or hypnosis. And then thirdly, our experience of time in meditation and under the influence of drugs. I would argue that drugs radically change our relationship with temporality itself, but in dreaming, you can certainly experience a complete lifetime of experience in a few moments. Why is that? If clock time is the true standard, then we need an explanation for dreaming. We don't have one. Nobody that I've heard from yet has one. If you happen to have one, I would love to hear that. Effectively, what I'm trying to demonstrate is that our delusion about flat time, while useful for technological, mechanical, and the concerns of physics, is not true. Whatever organisms are, they are capable of radical alterations of the experience of meaningful events per interval under conditions of sleep, trance, meditation, hypnosis, and so on. I'm crossing a street, and as you all know, when you come to a street and there's traffic, you're meeting a situation where time changes and the events that you have to attend to survive transform radically. Now you can hear the sound of that machine. And you'll notice that one of the things the machines do is produce loud, noisy vibrations that make it difficult for organisms to survive or communicate within them. Similarly, our computational technologies damage time in a way that's not immediately apparent to us, partly by producing heat and partly by producing various forms of highly regularized electromagnetic radiation. Wi-Fi signals, cell phone signals, the EM that comes off the electrical lines in our houses, and so forth. It has long been a dangerous myth that these have no obvious deleterious health consequences. I find that perspective to be insane and impossible, because our cells, people say like, well, you're in the EM field of the earth and the sun all the time, it doesn't hurt you. Yes, it's true. But what's going on in the earth and the sun are EM fields that life evolved in synchrony with. Life did not evolve in synchrony with the strange radiation of Wi-Fi, cell phones, and electricity and wires. And to say that it has no effect on us seems nuts to me, because our cells, at least at the skin surface, have to create and transform complex electromagnetic circumstances local to the membrane in order to do the various things they do to keep us alive. It seems to me that cells attempting to communicate adequately in a context where new forms of regularized mechanical EM are constantly being introduced is akin to people attempting to have a conversation in an underground indoor parking lot filled with diesel engines where you just keep adding louder engines because it doesn't kill the people outright, but they can no longer communicate. So I think there's a problem there for cellular life on Earth and our bodies. But there's a weirder problem, which is that what organisms are doing, cells and so forth, viruses, organs, is so unimaginably complex and profound that it's extremely delicate. And I suspect that there may be some kind of a constant with relationship to the biotemporal manifolds of Earth, where there's a limit to the amount of mechanical computation you can do without offloading something resembling temporal radiation into the temporal hyperstructures that the organisms create, which damages their synchronizations. And it seems that the organisms, whatever they are doing that we could imagine somewhat resembles computation, they've found a way not only around that problem, they've found a way to heal the temporal hyperstructures merely by existing. Whereas what the machines are doing, the incredible, strange, regularized iteration and frequency, the mechanicalization of the interactions of quanta, electrons, and so forth, if the particles are sentient or transcendent, I imagine that they would celebrate their participation in organisms and despise their participation in machines. Because in a way, you can see that what we do with machines is enslaving features of the temporal hyperstructures of Earth, particularly the particles. Right? It's probably glorious to be an electron or photon involved in a star. It's probably miserable to be an electron or photon involved in iterative computations in a microprocessor. Effectively, it would be a form of prisonized hell from this perspective. So I'm very concerned that there are forms of temporal damage, and of course, anytime we damage the biosphere, that damage lands in the temporal biorelational hyperstructures of Earth. But I'm very concerned that computation itself may be violating something that resembles a constant, that if you damage that, it produces desynchronization in biologies, which are highly synchronized and depend on that synchronization for their survival, behavior, and health. Well, I have made about a 4-mile circuit, and I am back at my home. I think I have managed to accomplish some of my goals today. So grateful to all of you who listen, subscribe, comment. Please feel free to ask questions, share my content however you feel you'd like to, and if you wish, support me on Patreon so that I can keep producing this free content for anyone who's interested in listening. May your life path and relationships be beautiful. May your dreams be profound. And may we all learn to remember some of the unimaginable beauty of our nature as human beings, as organisms, as living beings, and as modes of time-space. Thank you for joining me. Bye-bye for now.